How's it going, everyone? My name is Vince Carter, and welcome to my new series, Let's Talk China. China is a near-peer adversary which will likely obtain the capabilities necessary to challenge the US as the global leader. If successful, China will then have the ability to dictate the rules to a new international order, or dictate the rules to the globe. And as we'll see in future videos, we probably don't want China being in charge of the globe and having the ability to dictate the rules to us, or anybody else, for matter of fact. If we ever wish to overcome this threat, we must accurately and thoroughly understand it. In this series, I intend on covering Chinese history and how it shapes the modern Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP's, ideology and worldview today. The goal is to expose the rationale behind the CCP's international and domestic actions in order to gain a deeper understanding, so hopefully we can then predict some of the CCP's future actions. Here's an overview of what we're going to be covering in this series, but today we're going to be talking about all that lies beneath the heavens. If you ask a Chinese national, how old is your country, they will likely reply, China is a nation with 5,000 years of history. This is a massive amount of history, especially thinking about American history. We're formed in 1776. Their Chinese history dwarfs our history. And for the majority of this time frame, the Middle Kingdom was a dominant power on the globe, or a dominant power specifically within the region. Even though China was dominant, internally it oscillated between two different modes. Either between the bloodiest civil wars that humanity has ever witnessed, and we'll get to those, or unchallenged imperial rule. This oscillation is a key feature within Chinese history that I want you to think about as we continue forward. Under the Qing dynasty, China had reached its peak politically, militarily, and economically. If you take a look at the graphic that I have up on screen, you can see that the Middle Kingdom's territory had reached into modern day parts of Russia, Mongolia, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. If you think about today where China is and their modern day borders, and you think about some of the territorial disputes that are occurring there, especially with India, you can see that it all traces back to this point in history. As early as 1405, the Chinese sailors were sailing down into Indonesia, around India, up into the Strait of Hormuz, and even around the tip of Africa. You can see that during this period, 100 years prior to when the Europeans started their voyages, the Chinese were already sailing across the globe. And this is during the time when the Europeans were in the medieval ages. If we look at the size of the treasure fleet compared to Christopher Columbus' Santa Maria, you can see in this image there's a massive difference. This demonstrates the amount of wealth, the amount of power that the Chinese had at this time. And if the Chinese had chosen to do so, they could have started colonialism 100 years prior to when the Europeans did. This could have offered China a huge advantage in terms of resources, in terms of trade. But China has a very specific blend of racism that stopped them from actually pursuing this. And we'll cover that in a little bit, but it's very interesting. In mainland China, it was the emperor's duty to bring harmony to the Middle Kingdom. And it was a divine right that legitimized the emperor, called the mandate of heaven. This is that the heavens above give the emperor the right to rule over China, over the Middle Kingdom, all that lies beneath the heavens. And this mandate demands that the Chinese emperor brings harmony to the Middle Kingdom. And if the Middle Kingdom was to oscillate again from harmony into bloody civil wars or bloody rebellion, then that means the emperor was not fulfilling their mandate of heaven, and they no longer had the blessing of heaven. Because China's esteemed position at the center of the world, they viewed their culture, their language, and the political system as superior to all, the pinnacle of a universal hierarchy, that all others are attempting to be like China, but nobody could ever make it there. The Chinese viewed all others as subjects or barbarians who lived to serve China through tribute. If you look at this image that I have on screen, you can see that the nations in orange, these were tributary states. So what they had to do is that they had to send delegates to China with gifts or tribute, and then they would then have to make the journey to the capital of China and approach the emperor at his throne, and then give these gifts and bend the knee, so to speak, and give these gifts to the emperor, and recognizing that the Chinese held a superior position in the world, that they were at the center of the world, atop of everyone else. And in reality, the Chinese actually lost money in these because they were massive ceremonies with pomp and grandeur. And so the Chinese actually were losing income, but the purpose was the principle of it, was the act of it, was the demonstration and the recognition that China is at the center of the globe, is in charge of everybody else. They are the Middle Kingdom. The Chinese worldview at this time looked something along the lines of this, where the emperor sat in the middle on the throne of the Middle Kingdom. And then next are the inner subjects. So these are the majority citizens. This is the Han Chinese, the Manchus. And then outside of that, then you have the outer subjects, the minorities. You have the Uyghurs, you have the Tibetans, you have the Mongolians, people that need to be put in place, so to speak. Then you have the tributary states. Those are the states that we talked about in that last slide, which included Korea, Vietnam, Siam, and a few other states. And then finally, you have the barbarians. The barbarians are everyone else, the West, the Japanese, everyone else outside of this inner circle. Not only was China powerful, it was extremely wealthy. Up until the Industrial Revolution, China was far richer than the European states. China produced a greater share of the world's GDP than any Western power. Roughly 30% of the world's gross domestic product, or GDP, exceeding all of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States combined. If you take a look at your phone and flip it sideways really quick, you can see in this graph how the Chinese dominated GDP from 1500 to the mid 1800s. They're averaging around 30%, and it falls off rapidly in the mid 1800s. And we'll cover that later on in this series. I love this quote right here. It really sums up the era. China had been a relatively successful, self-contained, self-referential political, economic, philosophical, cultural, and religious system. But foreigners were viewed with a combination of suspicion and condensation as episodic invaders, culturally inferior, and irrelevant to China's national needs. There's no need to go and colonize Africa or India because their culture is inferior. We don't need anything that they have. We already sit at the pinnacle of humanity. So why would we go to Africa or India when we have everything we need here at home? Why would we go see Chris Brown in concert when we have Chris Brown here at home? This idea of Chinese divine right, cultural superiority, and national longevity is fundamental to Chinese communist thought and global ambitions today. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the Chinese specifically believe in this blend of racism still today, but the Chinese see this era as a golden era that they wish to return to. And not only do they need to return to it, it is their right to be there. That is normality. That is what is natural. That the Chinese sit atop at the pinnacle of humanity. China's 5,000 years of history dwarfs that of the United States, and it plays a crucial role in how their government operates. In the United States, we think about what can be accomplished in 4 years terms, while China thinks about what can be achieved in decades. Here in the US, sometimes a president comes in and what they do in 4 years is erased by the next president over the next 4 years. In China, there's a sense of continuity. Not necessarily a long-term plan, but there's the continuity of the shared goal, of the desired end state that they want to achieve, and that is getting back to that golden era. The Chinese Communist Party very likely draws upon this golden era and dreams of restoring China as the global leader with the sole authority, and has sought to rally its citizens behind this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In those words itself, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, that was uttered by Xi Jinping, who is the chairman of the Communist Party and the president of the Chinese state. That was uttered in 2012, and since then, we have seen military modernization, economic miracles, all trying to achieve this main goal of rejuvenation, of getting back to that golden era. Thank you guys for being with me in my first episode for the series. I appreciate it, and hopefully I see you guys in the future.